You're listening to part 2 in the series Joli Truelson, Connecting the Dots. For clarification, John Keith Miller has not been charged with any crime related to Joli Truelson's death. We have reached out to Miller to provide him the opportunity to address questions related to this series. At the time of publication, we have not received a response.
They're not personally invested in Joli or her case. They don't understand it. They didn't understand the suspect. This guy is a psychopath.
It was late Monday evening, 10 minutes to 11 to be exact, and a late model, two-door, hardtop, probably gold-colored car stopped. The long-haired, about 30-ish driver, the car drove east toward St. Paul.
Like, nothing rules this guy out, and nothing has since the beginning.
You know, she was killed with a knife. Joli was hit with a blunt instrument. But the thing is, it's the rage and the overkill in the car and just the senselessness to it.
You know, for the longest time, I thought I picked up the hitchhiker and I stabbed her and I put her in a snowbank. That's all I remembered until I brought out all the pictures.
Sergeant Mark Sushta with the Minneapolis Police Department's Homicide Division has been assigned to Joli's case for a few years. Yet even before the case was handed down to him, Joli's family felt like they were stuck in a decades-long cycle. Any effort on behalf of the family to move Joli's case forward was met with the same response. There is no physical evidence related to Joli's case that would or could move it forward in any meaningful way.
And it's almost, they're throwing up roadblocks. Now it's like they're using the fact that there's no evidence there to say, well, we can't do this or that, or, you know, there's no evidence, so you're screwed no matter what. And that's what's most frustrating, is that they threw away the evidence, now they're using that as an excuse.
But Miller's arrest changed everything. And when Joli's brothers heard of his arrest and confession, they reached out to Sergeant Sushta. They wanted him to interview Miller. A few days later, Sergeant Sushta traveled to the Dunn County Jail in Wisconsin, where Miller is being held.
Let me just read your rights real quick, and then I just got a few questions for you, okay?
And for 11 minutes, questioned him about Joli's death. But before he went to meet Miller, Sergeant Sushta asked her brothers to send over a digital photo of Joli. That's because the Minneapolis Police Department didn't have one. Not one photo of Joli. Sergeant Sushta didn't even have the option of pulling up an image of Joli from the Minnesota BCA cold case playing cards, a deck that was distributed throughout the state in 2008 to draw attention to 52 Minnesota cold cases. And that's because Joli's case wasn't included.
To this day, Minneapolis Police Department does not have a picture of Joli in their files. Can you believe that? In their file, there's no picture of Joli. He asked me for one.
Joli's family has plenty of photos of her. I was able to see them in person when I sat down with Thor and Trigg at their childhood home in Minneapolis. But unfortunately, the one person who maybe should have seen firsthand those same portraits and photographs of Joli that I laid eyes on didn't. Miller was only presented with a picture that was taken on a phone of Joli's original portrait, as Sergeant Sushta requested.
I had to send him the picture, the one under there.
And he just wanted a picture of a picture to go in there. He didn't come and say, oh, can I get some pictures, some portraits of Joli? He didn't prepare at all.
I want to talk about why these pictures of Joli are so important. When officers knocked on Miller's door in Owatonna, Minnesota, on November 7th, 2024, to arrest him for Mary's murder, Miller initially denied he had anything to do with her death. He didn't change his tune until he heard they found his DNA on a hat left at the scene. When they showed him a photograph of the crime scene and his hat, his memory of that day came flooding back. Basically, he didn't tell the truth or didn't remember the truth until he was confronted with reality, and that reality came to life through DNA evidence and photographs. Here's what Miller told Minneapolis Police Sergeant Sushta when being questioned about Joli's death.
So, John, if you wouldn't mind, like I read the case that you confessed to that you're in jail for now, and how you were honest and remorseful, and I really appreciate that. And obviously, you are very close to the end of your life. I mean, you're 84 years old, right? We're never promised tomorrow.
Yeah.
And so I am really looking for closure for what happened with Joli.
You know, for the longest time, I thought I picked up a hitchhiker and I stabbed her and I put her in a snowbank. That's all I remember until he brought out all the pictures.
Right.
And then I must have been holding it back and didn't want to remember it because...
So that happened in 1974. This happened in 1972.
Based on Miller's statement, photographs related to Mary's murder were critical in his recollection of events of that day. Yet during that line of questioning with Sergeant Sushta, there were no images of Minnehaha Creek, the area where she was found. There was no photo of a hammer, like the one found in R. Miller's trunk 2 days after Joli was found dead. No images of cool cigarettes, like the ones allegedly found in that same vehicle. And there certainly were no images from her death scene because, if they did exist, they are no longer in the possession of the Minneapolis Police Department. Yet the lack of photographs presented to Miller was just one of the concerns stemming from that interview. Miller provided what could be false information to Sergeant Sushta multiple times. Despite that, Miller was never challenged. He was taken at his word. Now, we are about to go into the weeds here with details, but this information is critical when connecting the dots in this story. Eyewitnesses in Mary's case and Joli's case described a gold-colored two-door vehicle with circular headlights. These details play a key factor when looking at the commonalities between the two cases. And we know Miller was driving a newer model vehicle in the early 1970s. Documents related to Miller's 1977 divorce show that he drove a 1971 Gremlin at that time. A distinct feature of the 1971 Gremlin, its circular headlights. Even now, Miller doesn't deny he drove a Gremlin, but he recently provided information about that vehicle that seemed to throw investigators off his trail.
Do you know what kind of vehicle you drove back then?
It had to be a 72 Gremlin, maybe?
A 72 what?
Gremlin?
Gremlin. What color was it? Do you remember?
Blue with a gold stripe along the side.
Okay. How long did you have that vehicle?
Oh, till it died. I went up to, where did I go? I went to California. It belonged to my wife, and I took it when I left. But her folks came up and picked the car up, even when it was junk, because it was up to took 40 quarts of oil to go.
For decades, the Dunn County Sheriff's Office described the vehicle Mary was removed from as golden. Dunn County Sheriff's Office Sergeant Jason Stocker confirmed that when I spoke with him this summer about Mary's case, just a few months before Miller's arrest. Miller's divorce records from his second wife did provide information about the vehicle. It was a 1971 Gremlin. A VIN number was included, but because the car was made before 1981, the VIN number cannot be used to identify the color of the car. His ex-wife, who certainly would be able to answer that question, has unfortunately chosen not to speak with us. So we took a closer look at the Dunn County eyewitness. His name was Denny Anderson. Almost immediately after witnessing that horrific scene, he called law enforcement and told them what he saw. He was able to provide a description of both the driver and the vehicle. This part is important. Based on his description, law enforcement officials were able to create a sketch of the driver. The sketch was distributed throughout the area, and it depicted a man in roughly his 30s with mid-length straight hair and a mustache. We obtained mugshots of Miller from 1969, and when you compare the mugshots with the sketch side by side, it's a match. And if he provided that detailed of a physical description, what is the likelihood that he got the color of the car completely wrong? Here's another piece of information that does not prove Miller was lying, but casts doubt on his claims that his car was blue. Denny has since passed, but we recently learned that on that day, he had a passenger in his vehicle, and by all accounts, it sounds like the passenger's description of the car matched Denny's. Denny's passenger has since passed away, too. We did recently speak to some of their neighbors, though. Here's Mary Dodge, who lives on the rural dead-end road where Mary's body was found. She and her husband, Jack, knew Denny and his passenger. She was home alone with her 3-month-old baby on that day, and like her neighbors, the incident horrified her. It took away her sense of safety, and because of the significance of it all, she remembers quite a bit from that time, including the description of the car they were all terrified to see drive by.
Yeah, I'd imagine that's like, you know, like you said, it was such a big deal for your community. And even though you weren't, you know, families of the victim, I mean,
Right.
that still probably changed so much about how you guys lived or how you felt in terms of safety.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it scared us to death. Our son he was 3 months old, and
Oh, no.
I was scared to death. I was
Yeah,
just,
of
because
course.
at that point that I found out from the Culligan man, or Gibson, whatever he worked for, we had no idea if this was somebody running around and killing people. I mean, but and of course, with a new baby, you know, you're very more so protective.
Yeah.
Mary and Jack's recollection of the color of that vehicle is slightly different than Dunn County's description.
I said, Jack, what color do you remember that car was? And he said orange.
Orange,
That's
okay.
That's what the color came back to us there in our memory. We never saw it, but that's what we had heard.
At first, I was taken aback by her statement, so I looked up the colors American Motors offered for their 1971 line of Gremlins. There were 2 colors that could be described as golden. One is labeled as canary yellow. It's quite bright. And the other is labeled as mustard yellow. And I have to say, I can understand how one would describe it as either orange or golden colored.
So I pulled up the 1971 colors for, since that's what he was driving, was a 1971 Gremlin.
Yeah.
And you know, I'm looking at the gold colored. There's a canary yellow, but then there's like an orange gold.
Yep, that would be
It's
it.
the only other gold color, so that makes sense.
The color of the vehicle wasn't the only questionable piece of information Miller provided in his interview with Sergeant Sushna, though. There were also issues with where he lived and spent time around the time of Joli's murder.
Back in, I know 1972 was a long time ago, but where were you living back then?
72. Let's see, I was 32. Trying to remember, 32. I was 32 years old. Seemed like I was in Austin.
Austin?
I think, Minnesota, yeah.
Austin, Minnesota. Did you ever come up to Minneapolis?
No.
Never.
No, hardly ever. If I did, it must have been like for a concert or something, maybe.
Okay. But you never drove through there casually? You never had any friends up there?
No.
Okay.
Miller's marriage application for his second wife tells a different story. Okay, so here we have him living in the application, dated May 8th, 1973, was filed in Hennepin County, and his address shows he was living in New Hope, Minnesota, a suburb of Minneapolis. The marriage application was filed in 1973, a year after Joli was killed. That doesn't put Miller in Minneapolis on July 3rd, 1972, the day Joli was last seen, but it does cast doubt on the idea that he never went to Minneapolis, except to maybe catch a concert. The man is 84, but he seems to remember quite a few details from that time period in the 1970s, including the type of car he drove. So, it's reasonable to question whether Miller knowingly provided false information about where he lived and how much time he spent in Minneapolis. And then there's this. Minneapolis city records show a John Miller with the first name spelled the same, Jon, with a Minneapolis apartment address, located roughly 2 miles from Uptown's Lake Calhoun, where Joli was last seen. Miller was released from California's San Quentin prison that year, May 5th, 1972, a few months before Joli was killed, so we know he was a free man at that time. And it's certainly possible he settled in Minneapolis. That same Jon Miller is not listed in Minneapolis city records from 1973. Instead, he pops up in New Hope, Minnesota, after meeting his wife, who's from the Twin Cities area. That tells us that the John Miller registered in Minneapolis city records in 1972 could be John Keith Miller, and that would be significant. It would put Miller just miles from the area where Joli was picked up. It would also cement his claims that he never went to Minneapolis in 1972 as completely false, on top of his statements that he never went to Minneapolis around that time period. But at the time we are releasing part 2 of this series, we cannot verify that Miller was, in fact, living in Minneapolis in 1972. And that's because there's one missing piece of the puzzle. His parole records from California, where he was serving time for a 1969 conviction for armed robbery. In a letter to the Minneapolis Police Department, hand-delivered in March of this year on behalf of Joli's family, they requested the police department obtain Miller's parole transfer and supervision records, which would confirm Miller's immediate address after release. That letter to the Minneapolis Police Department also requested another interview with Miller, an interview that would challenge Miller on his falsehoods provided the first time around.
He thought, I think he was just going to go and, maybe get a confession and then spike the football. I solved a 50-year-old murder case. This is great. And he didn't have a greater plan.
At the time this podcast published, Joli's family had not heard back from the Minneapolis Police Department regarding their requests. While we don't yet have the parole records, the missing piece of the puzzle, there are other pieces of this story that have come together to paint a picture of Miller's criminal and personal history, including court records related to his 1969 armed robbery conviction and statements from those who have been personally victimized by Miller. In part 3.
He dragged me down the street after he broke my jaw, and I kept saying, help, help, and he'd say, she's just drunk, she don't know what she's saying, nobody would help me. And he says, if I can't have you, nobody's going to have you. He threatened me. I thought he was going to kill me then.
John Keith Miller's plea hearing for the murder of Mary Schlais is scheduled for Thursday, March 27th in Dunn County. I will be there, and part 3 of the series will include coverage from that day. The Vault is a Forum Communications podcast. If you or anyone you know has any information about John Keith Miller or Joli Truelson, please reach out. You can find my contact information in the show notes. For our past coverage on John Keith Miller, Mary Schlais, and Joli Truelson, visit inforum.com/thevault. Again, I would like to thank the family of Joli Truelson for lending their voices and research to this series. Tune in next week for part 3. Thank you for listening.